This week on the podcast, we have Helen Ledwick, the author of Why Mums Don't Jump, the ARIA-nominated podcast, and now book. Helen will be sharing with us about how she overcame her own sense of taboo in order to talk about prolapse and pelvic floor dysfunction, obviously a topic very close to my heart. So, why mums don't jump?
Yeah.
Incredible. I mean, I think we've talked about this before, but I think the two of us are probably, well, I've never met anybody else, but of a handful of women who have quit our successful careers in order to throw ourselves into fighting injustices and pelvic floor health dysfunction.
Yes, it's an unusual move.
But I think probably born out of similar experiences, right? For you, similarly, it was about becoming a mum. Do you want to talk me through it?
Yeah. I feel like I'm kind of like an accidental advocate for pelvic health because, you know, it's just one thing has happened after another, and it all started about 8 years ago now, just after my youngest child, my son, was born. And I found out I had a prolapse, which, as you will know, is where your pelvic organs can move out of place, your bladder, your bowel, your uterus, often after childbirth, sometimes after menopause. And it was just so shocking to me because I had never even heard that term before. Not before I was like sitting on the floor with a mirror and looking at Google Images and reading that my insides were falling out. And that was just a really terrifying and lonely place to find myself in. And then just as time went on, I just found myself really struggling with it. You know, I felt very broken. My symptoms are not, I always say my symptoms are not as bad as they are for some people, but like I don't have incontinence, but I do have some discomfort and I feel a bulge. And yeah, I felt very embarrassed about it. I felt quite ashamed, and I didn't know where to take it or where to go with it. So I sort of carried on like that for a while. And I think the worst thing for me, actually, one of the hardest things, was what it kind of did to me as an active mum that wanted to run around and jump after my kids, because at the time the advice was very much like, don't run, don't jump, don't lift heavy, but there wasn't really any proper advice about what you could do instead or how you could sort of rehabilitate yourself to live with it or manage it the best way that you could. So I just felt like I would never be this mum that I wanted to be, and I felt a lot of grief around that. And I just really struggled, and it kind of went on like that for a few years until I was coming up to the age of 40 and having a rethink about my whole life, some sort of midlife crisis, I don't know. And I decided that I needed to start talking about this because nobody was. So I went on Instagram and started an account, and it just sort of snowballed from there because I realised how many other women were going through a similar thing, all on their own, and yeah, a couple of years into that, the podcast came, and then the book, and now here we are. So yeah, that's why I say accidental advocate, because throughout that journey, it's just got bigger. You know, it's more than just my own experience now. It's like, it's everybody else's. And I just feel really strongly that we need to start talking about it.
And I think, you've shed a light on a taboo that is so common and that people don't talk about it. Like the fact that you didn't know about prolapse until you had one. I'd never heard of prolapse until I was pregnant. I'm sure many women listening to this are in a similar position as well. That is shocking, right? Like, why do we not even know about these issues? They hardly talk about pelvic floor health, and prolapse seems to be even more taboo, right? And it's so common post-birth. 40% of women during their lifetime, but I think it's even up to 80%, isn't it, post-birth of some form of prolapse. It's a natural, I'm not saying it's natural to have a prolapse, but your body as a woman goes through so much change during pregnancy and childbirth, and there's very little education around this. Do you think, looking back, do you wish that they had talked to you more about it? Or even, I think, around the childbirth, you and I have talked about this before as well, right? This sort of, you had a real determination, right, to have a vaginal birth. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah. So with my daughter, my eldest child, she was a C-section, and you know, it's hard when you have a newborn. However you have a baby, that's going to be difficult. But I always had this sense that like I hadn't done it properly, and that was why she never slept, and that was why breastfeeding was so very difficult. She had a tongue tie, but it was, but this time I was going to do it properly. And I'm using kind of air inverted commas because obviously that, there are many different ways to have a baby and none is better than the other, but I was determined that I would do that. And sure enough, I ended up with a 3rd degree tear, which, I often question, is that why I had the prolapse in the end? So you end up with all these whys. But I think more generally speaking, like if you go into that circumstance, just knowing the level of trauma that your body is going to go through, whether you do end up with a tear or whether it goes, as smoothly as possible. I don't think we have the education or the understanding of what a woman's body goes through during childbirth. And therefore, we don't take seriously like the rehabilitation that's needed afterwards or the rest and the recovery. And I think we're talking more about that now, the sort of, what women need in terms of postpartum support.
Yeah, but I mean, you're right. There's not the education, but there's also, I feel like sometimes in the UK at least, having based on my own experiences, that you said the word properly, you get given these an almost ideology, and there's sometimes a sense of not giving women, keeping them in the dark as if they can't be trusted. For example, based on my own experiences, I was told by a midwife, if you should never give any formula milk, never do any combination feeding, because that's going to be the thin edge of the wedge, as if you can't be trusted. If you ever try it once, there's no looking back. And I think, at Elvie and my own views, the same as what you're saying, which is all women should be able to make their own choices about their own body and their own baby. At Elvie, we can support women if they want to use a breast pump, if they want to breastfeed exclusively, and so on. And to your point about the way you give birth, again, I think the country's beginning to change a little bit around giving women more choice. But I remember when I was pregnant and I was told, again, by a sort of pregnancy group, sort of semi-professional, she said, if you have a cesarean rather than natural childbirth, I mean, is that really what you want? Would you rather prefer your toddler to be playing with an iPhone or in a sand pit?
What?
Yeah, I mean, it's these kind of things that this idea
makes no sense.
Or this idea that you're a better mother if you have a natural childbirth. And I just think as women, we're just constantly being judged around our own bodies, right?
It's true. And I think all of it, for me, it comes down to this question as to when do we tell women, right? So because the first thing that everyone says, or often the women who I speak to who have similar issues, like, why did no one tell me when I was pregnant? We should be telling women when they're pregnant that these things can happen. We should be educating them about birth and about breastfeeding and all of these things. But actually, no, like that, these things should just be a conversation from the day we're born. And that's where I've kind of, through doing this over the last few years, that's where I've arrived back at, because if we're using the right language, that's a whole other conversation, isn't it? If we're using the right anatomical language with our children, if they are educated as to different parts of their body, as to how they will develop, as to, the realities of birth and not some sort of Hollywood version of it, then they can make their own decisions in a kind of timely way without falling to the pressures that do come from different groups with different ideas about what's right one week and what's right the next. So for me, that's been quite a learning curve for me as well, because when I started even the podcast, which was when my son was 5, so 5 years into this, I still couldn't say vulva and vagina. I was still using euphemisms, fanny and this, and I'm cringing now just even thinking about that. But so it's going to be like, it's a hard one for us people to get their heads around, but I really, the idea of using the correct language, not covering it up, that's what's going to inform our children as they get older, so that when they get to the point of pregnancy and having babies, then it's easier to make an informed decision about things.
But you said the Hollywood sort of ideal of birth. I mean, you're right? You sort of see these images of women giving birth and then sort of smiling happily afterwards. But where does that come from? I mean, it is Hollywood, but it's also, I felt like no doctor at any point is really telling you, to your point, what the different options are, what might happen, so you can kind of plan in advance in a more, I suppose what you're saying is methodical and scientific way. Yeah.
Oh, it's hard, isn't it? Because I'm not, you can only plan for so much, and you can only take on board so much information, and there are so many eventualities that can happen regardless of whatever kind of birth you have. So I don't know what the answer to that is, except that definitely a sense of openness. I know some people don't always want to hear about births that haven't gone beautifully, this beautiful water birth with the whale music and all the rest of it. But I just think it's important that we hear everyone's experience. We hear all these different accounts of what happens, because it's just reality, isn't it? And the more honest we can be and the better informed about the different eventualities, that's going to set us up for the rest of our lives, you know, after we've had kids, and what our bodies have been through and how they can recover afterwards.
But I think particularly though here in the UK, one of the problems as well though is the NHS is so overburdened. So it always felt to me during my pregnancy journey that the focus was always on the fetus and the well-being of the fetus and the baby. And there's just very little space around what's happening to us as women and our bodies. And I think that is different in some European countries. I think in the US it's probably more similar to the UK. I don't know what your experience on that is, but even here in the UK, right, we have the new strategy for women's health. They talk about the 6-week postnatal checkup, but I literally looked on the NHS website this morning, and it still just says, you know, instructions for your doctor: check on scar, check if you're using contraception, check on breastfeeding. Like, there's still nothing there really about pelvic floor or prolapse.
No, there isn't. I asked on Instagram a while back about this, and it was interesting what people said. And it was very much, I mean, people have different experiences, some of it better than others. I mean, I don't even know that people realise this, but in the UK since 2020, I think you are now entitled to a separate checkup. So the mum should get a 6-week checkup and the baby should get a 6-week checkup, and they should be separate events. But even so, you know, you're talking, what is it, 7 minutes or something to like give you a full assessment after one of the most physical and emotionally challenging events of your whole life. And yeah, the contraception question.
This is exactly what you're thinking about 6 weeks after you've had a baby.
I've had a 3rd-degree tear. My perineum is no longer where it was. But yeah, of course, contraception is the thing. And of course, that's the woman's responsibility, right? Not the man's, only the woman's. So another part of the problem, I think, when it comes to pelvic health is that health professionals don't get enough training in it themselves. So, you know, and not every GP would even necessarily particularly know what they were looking for, I don't believe. I have women getting in touch with me from the podcast, from the book, who themselves are GPs and have found themselves with incontinence or prolapse, and just suddenly realising the impact of that, and you know, being honest that they don't have enough training in how to deal with that. But
why is this? Is it because it's to do with the vagina, because it's taboo, or...?
Because it's women's health, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, like this is centuries of, you know, we've had it from the UK government when they launched the women's health strategy. It's a healthcare system designed by men for men, and all the incredible work that people like Caroline Criado-Perez have done to expose, you know, how the need for research into conditions that, you know, are unique to women. And it's all of that, and it's centuries and layers, and it's going to take a long time to unpick.
And I think this is where what you're doing and what I'm doing, we have a lot in common, right? Obviously, you're a journalist by background. I was working more in health research, but we're trying to do the same thing through different ways, right? So I'm focusing more on the technology side with Elvie, and you're also on terms of changing the communication and the messaging. But even if I look over the last 10 years since I started Elvie, on a more positive note, we've seen some untabooing of womanhood, or some issues which have become more positive. So, for example, at Elvie, in terms of breast pumping, breastfeeding, we've seen huge success in terms of, you know, we're not there yet, but changing the tide a little bit from a negative, stigmatized issue into something a bit more positive. We are still struggling.
So when I started talking about it, I didn't know what the language I should use was, in the sense of, like, I knew what it technically was, but I also knew that people wouldn't understand what that meant. I had never heard of prolapse. I'd never heard of pelvic floor dysfunction. It meant nothing to me. I thought I had an idea about incontinence and things like that. But it was really trying to find language that people could understand and know that, oh, that's me, that, you know, I can relate to that, that's me. So, I mean, I started using the words pelvic floor problems, which is, you know, not a scientific, but for me, it's a bit of a catch-all. Mostly, I just wanted to make it relatable. So the why mums don't jump seemed to me to be kind of just getting that message out of, like, look, there's a reason for this and we can talk about it, and I'm not saying it's right, but this is what it is, and now maybe we can go on to talk about, like, how to make that better.
I mean, I'm nodding my head. It's funny because everything you're saying is exactly the sort of thing that we've gone through time and time again at Elvie, and it's almost tragic in how we haven't been able to claim back some of these words within women's health, to your point, either are too scientific or they don't belong to women, right? The fact that most people in the US call pelvic floor health Kegels, named after the man who discovered that part of anatomy, just feels wrong. And for me, the language is so important. Because I'd been working in HIV before, and I could see, having worked in AIDS, but it used to just be called AIDS, and there was all these connotations about just dying of AIDS, and pictures of people in Africa starving and dying, and then they managed to kind of switch to something, it's still obviously a very difficult chronic disease, but talking about living with HIV, HIV positive, and trying to get that to be more positive. So with Elvie, very much, even the name Elvie came from trying to not call it pelvic floor, trying to not call it Kegels, but the original name, which is levator muscle, so elevate, and therefore Elvie.
I think it's just using the terms again and again and again until they just become normal, because they're just words at the end of the day, aren't they? And it's important that we use them to address the issues that we're actually talking about, and that people have a sense of what that means.
So with all your branding as well, like having looked at it, it's all, just talk us through that, because that must have been a journey on how to get to think about how we talk about these issues.
I think one of the really magical things about what's happened with Why Mums Don't Jump is that it's really galvanised people to want to get involved. When you share stories that you've never told anyone before, and you hear someone else speaking about the same thing, it just resonates so deeply that people send me these incredible messages and like emails with, whole life stories attached and Word documents, because they've never had a chance to share these stories before. So like the connection is really deep. And I've had it a few times where people have been like, what can I do? I want to help. Like, thank you for saying these things that I've never been able to say. Now I want to help. And one listener, so Kat Pearson, she's incredible. She lives in Bristol now. She is a designer, and she offered to help me with some branding. So I was like, great, she's going to help me like redesign my logo. It's going to look so much better. But she was way more professional than I was. So through the pandemic, actually, we sat down online, and she went through this whole design process with me. And like, as a listener, she understood even better than I did as the creator of it, because all the feelings were there for her, all the emotions and all the kind of, the points that we really needed to drive home. So we did all these branding exercises of creating, like, I think we ended up being a roller skating, disco dancing, tiger drinking phase. And it was just so important to make it this really positive, bold, loud, uplifting feel to it, because in such a contrast to the sort of shame and the hiding away and the stigma that so many people experience when they have pelvic floor problems. And I love that, because when it first happened to me, the first few years, I found that a very difficult place to be. And even though I was a journalist, I couldn't find the right information or support to kind of help me understand what to do or where to go with it. And so what you do instead, you find yourselves in forums online and down rabbit holes, Google rabbit holes, but often just like in really depressing, like really sad places, where everyone is going through their lowest moments together because they haven't got anyone to talk about it. So I really wanted to sort of contrast that and just have this big, loud, proud, we can have this conversation. And we'll probably cry, but we'll definitely laugh, and all of that is okay. So I love my branding. Again, just a sort of magical thing that happened.
Going from the podcast to the book, was that also part of the big plan on how to get the message out?
Again, no. I sound really disorganised, but genuinely this is how it has happened. Another listener who was a literary agent and also just really resonated with the podcast. It helped her through some difficult times. Also just really shared a passion for ending the taboo around these issues. Was like, have you considered writing a book? I had not considered writing a book. My background's in journalism, but it's very much broadcast journalism. So the idea of like writing a lot of words is terrifying to me. But she was great, and she encouraged me to do it, and she, kept me sane, and we put together a book proposal, which was then picked up by the publisher, Allen and Unwin, and it all happened. And Kat, who designed my branding, also created some beautiful illustrations which are in the book, which again just give off this real positive line drawings of ordinary women going through, different aspects of pelvic health worries. Yeah, it's just all one thing after another. And I'm just going with it now. I'm just saying yes. If people offer it, I'll just say yes.
It's a snowball. I think being disorganised is too harsh. I mean, actually, in that case, and I'm probably the most disorganised person at Elvie as well, because I think we've interviewed other entrepreneurs as well on this podcast, and I think that's something about when you take this leap, you walk away from the known, from your career, and you do something completely unknown, and you have no idea where it's going to take you. I mean, to me, that's the thrill. That's the exciting thing.
Yeah.
Like when I started with pelvic floor trainer, I never thought I was going to do breast pump. You never know where it's going to lead next. I kind of love that bit, but I suppose it can be seen as disorganised. I'm just thinking actually Elvie.
Yeah. Maybe disorganised not the right word, but I have never been so far out of my comfort zone as I have in the past few years. And everyone says, "Oh, it's great to get out of your comfort zone," but sometimes I feel like it'd be good to get back again afterwards. But I feel like I'm just stuck there now, but then that's where these opportunities come from, isn't it? And fundamental to it all is just this really strong belief that this is just something that I need to do now, and I have this opportunity to try to end the taboo and to just talk about these issues that people have felt trapped with for so long. And I feel like I just have to just crack on and say yes.
And who knows what's going to happen in the future, but I think what you're doing with bringing everyone together as well is it'll keep building momentum. I mean, that's the only way we're going to get change to happen, right?
Absolutely. And I see that as well. So through what I've been doing, I've obviously have a large network now of contacts in pelvic health, and especially in pelvic health physiotherapy. Those people are amazing, and they have been banging on for years about all the things that women can be doing after childbirth to improve their chances of getting their lives back afterwards. But I guess sometimes it just takes someone with personal experience of that condition to really cut through to other women who might need to hear that. And I feel like that's maybe what the podcast has done. And so it's great because now I feel like we're kind of bringing all those different voices together, the women who are struggling with pelvic floor problems, but also the physiotherapists and also some fitness professionals as well. And I'm enjoying the fact that maybe it's a chance to bring all those different voices together with health professionals as well.
But you had to bring your personal voice, and that must have been incredibly hard, no? I mean, unless are you the sort of person who always would talk about things quite openly, bodily fluids, odours, whatever's happening generally.
Some people are, right? There are those people who don't have a problem with discussing anything in life, and even their, gynecological anatomy, they just don't have an issue with it. But I am not one of those people at all. I wasn't brought up that way. I went to a Catholic high school in Lancashire in the 1990s, and this was just not a subject of conversation. So you probably see me all bristling now because even now I do struggle talking about it. But it gets easier, right? The more that you do it. But also I think it's really important sometimes that if people see that struggle, you resonate with it more, don't you? And you think, well, if they can do it, then I can do it as well. So that was really hard. And the first episode of the podcast I recorded, I knew that I did have to tell my story because that explains my whole reason for the rest of it, right? So how I was going to record that, I didn't know. I didn't feel like I could just sit and record myself on my own. So I ended up recording a conversation that I had with my best friend from school. But even, this is someone who has known me since I was 10 or something. We've been through all of life changes together, boyfriends, babies, the whole lot. And I was even nervous to talk to her about it. It's on the drive to her house, I've got a cold sweat going on and my hands are slipping off the steering wheel a bit because you're just putting yourself out there so much. And I think really actually, beside the embarrassment, which sometimes can feel a bit okay, just get on with it, it was just this idea that I didn't want to reduce myself to a broken vagina.
Yeah.
I didn't want that to be me and my only thing and the thing that everyone would then think of me as.
It's funny. So for me, it wasn't personal so much on the prolapse side, but there is, I think for any of us entrepreneurs who are driven by something very, there has to be something inside that's very emotional at our core to drive us to create a business. And for me, it was, without getting into too much detail, but it's definitely my childhood and my mother and her addictions, all these things, which it's exactly the same as you. I couldn't talk about them because I would get too emotional. But then people said, you need to talk about that a little bit more to explain why you've ended up doing what you're doing. And to your point, actually, the more you talk about it, after a while, you become desensitized to it. And I think for anybody listening, who's thinking about, because there's so many taboo issues, right? Or there's so many things we don't talk about in society that affect so many people. For people listening who are thinking, well, I want to do something, but I just don't feel like I can talk about it. I think both you and I, we've had this experience, right? That the more you do it, not only do you become less emotional about it, which in some ways can be cathartic, I find myself, but also then it opens up all the other people in the world who've also been waiting for somebody to talk about it. And that emotional outpouring is incredibly, like you've said, it sounds incredibly fulfilling to be able to help people, right?
Yeah.
It must be a bit overwhelming, though, if people are writing you big Word documents of
it can be
their issues.
It can genuinely be. I always read them all. I try to respond. And I'm always really clear that I don't have all the answers. I can't fix people. That's not my job. It's not my expertise. I wouldn't, I can't pretend that I can. But what I've found is that actually sometimes you don't need to fix people to massively improve their quality of life, because sometimes it is just as simple as knowing you're not alone, knowing that there is hope, and signposting people to support or medical help. Sometimes that's enough to make a massive difference, because often it's as much as it is the physical problems in themselves, it's the mental health, it's the impact of those things on your quality of life. And sometimes if you just take away that fact that you're not on your own with it and that there is hope with it, I feel like that can make a massive difference. So yeah,
and everybody has a story to tell. I mean, I find, I'm sure you're the same, like you go to parties and once people find out what you were, everybody wants to come and talk to you. I mean, I even have like men come out to me like, that's my wife over there, she's got this and this problem. And I'm like, okay, you don't need to tell me more, she can come and talk to me herself if she wants.
I welcome it. The mum running across the playground at pickup going, I've got a prolapse. I'm like, brilliant. Okay.
But with the family, I mean, how funny enough, actually, the person who struggled the most when I started working in pelvic floor health was my dad, because he didn't know how to explain to his male friends about what his daughter was doing. But I think once I gave him a bit more of the science and the numbers, he was kind of okay with it. But,
that's really
And you've got the kids as well. I remember trying to explain to my son when he was 4 where Elvie trainer went.
The kids is an interesting one, isn't it? But then, they take it in their stride. Yeah. They didn't do me any favours. I remember when... for years, my son, who's 8 now, would tell everyone within, a mile radius, Mummy's got a broken bottom, because that's how he understood it. But there's no way that you can hear that from a child and then not have to then expand on what they actually mean. So, yeah, I loved him for that.
So sweet. But to your point, also, people just want more information. They're desperate for it. And I think what you've managed to do is also highlight the range of options out there. Like, having heard your podcast, you talk about getting pessaries fitted, and it's just, there's a lot more to manage this than simply ending up on the sort of surgeon's table, right?
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And I think, again, it starts from birth, right? So, you will know that the advice now is that girls from the age of 12 are taught about the importance of pelvic floor exercises and doing those throughout your lifetime. Yeah, there's such a range of conservative measures, I think we call them, don't we? That I didn't know about when it happened to me, and it's as much as it is pelvic floor exercises, but it's also things like, strengthening your entire core and your glutes and your thighs to, become best buddies to your pelvic floor so that they're taking some of the impact so that you can still get out there and do your exercise and feel fit again. Because, if you're being told don't lift, don't jump, don't pick up your kids, like that's not going to do you any favours health-wise going forward, either mentally or physically. And yeah, pessaries. I wore a pessary for a while. I'm still on this never-ending journey of trying to find the right one for me. And these are, silicone devices, which, as will sit inside your vagina and help to hold up prolapsed pelvic organs, or you can get ones for incontinence, which are slightly different as well. And that is just like a really simple bit of kit. And if you find the right one that fits you, that could be you then for the rest of your life. You might not need anything else after that.
Isn't it crazy that there isn't one that fits you, right? Like, it's so, in the days where you can customize and personalize anything,
That
why
is in
can't
the
we
offing, I believe.
personalise?
There in development in Canada. There's a company that's working on
So Dan, we can't do that, Elvie.
using AI and ultrasound, ultrasound and things like that.
Exactly. And I mean, being more positive, there is more money going into this, right? Like femtech, now valued to be a $50 billion sector within that pelvic floor health, is one of the key segments. And I mean, just looking to the future, what are the sort of the positive things that you see on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, that just brings me joy. Like the fact that I didn't even know that, the sort of level of investment, because no one's, you know more about this than I do, but no one's investing in something that they don't believe in, right? That they can't talk about.
Again, being a bit negative about where we're at, the problem still is anything to do with vaginas is still seen as niche, right?
Yeah.
And I think investors struggle to see how can we break the taboo and how can we scale, because they need to see traction. But I think we all just need to keep chipping away at it, right? So we're working on the technology side, you're working on the campaigning side, and we will get there because women need this, right? And once you offer them the education or the technology, they will use it.
I feel sometimes it's hard because are you in a bubble? But I feel like the dial is turning on this stuff. Just, the conversations that I'm hearing, the newspaper articles that you're seeing, the radio interviews that are happening. I feel like people are emboldened now to talk about these issues more so than they were 5-6 years ago when I started talking about these issues. And for me, that's the key, isn't it? Because it's like with menopause, once you get this kind of massive support around it, the massive people feeling able to discuss these issues and empowered to advocate for their own health when they go and see a GP or when they're in the workplace or wherever it is. Once you get that massive voices talking about it, then the rest follows because they're going to demand better technology and better care and better treatments and research that doesn't exist at the moment. So to me, that's the key for everything. And I feel like that is changing.
Yeah, no, we need to keep building the momentum. We will get to that tipping point at some point. And it is absolutely. I've seen so many changes. The way, like you say, women talking about it.
Yeah.
People just being able to say, yeah, I have this issue, and
I think younger women as well. Like I think that is also part of it. And but
especially prolapse, right? Because that's often seen as an issue that affects women more post-menopause. Would you say?
Yeah, no, I think that is still an issue. I get so many messages from people who have been told by doctors and surgeons that really they only see older people and that at that point it's for surgery and that pessaries are only really for older people and see how you get on and all that sort of messaging around it. So I think there is still a misconception that it is only.
Is that because, I suppose during menopause your body loses collagen, right? So that happens on the inside of your body. So I think it gets exacerbated. Yeah. But it's the point that earlier it's just more hidden, or women are just putting up with it?
Well, I was thinking about this the other day because I think it comes down to the fact that when these problems start for a lot of women, you will know there is this sense, and we are, sometimes it comes from health professionals, sometimes it's just society, that it's normal when you've had a baby to leak a bit or to feel different down there. Nothing's going to be the same. And we just put up with that, don't we? We just sort of try and get on with our lives. So at that point, we're probably thinking, don't really need to go ask, a GP appointment because kind of expecting this, we'll see how we go. And I think a lot of people put up with that for a lot of years. I mean, I feel like there's a figure, I think it's 7 years an average before people go to see the GP for incontinence, which is a huge amount of time. But then what happens is that women who are, struggling a bit, but maybe keeping a lid on things throughout their, let's say, late 30s and 40s, get into perimenopause, hormone levels start to change, and any issues that were there before become exacerbated or more exposed. So the older we get, I guess, the worse these problems are, and we haven't addressed them up to this point. So, by the time we do seek help, it's probably a lot later than it could have been. One
of the reasons we've got this taboo, you said it's centuries old, right? So I assume here you're referring to the fact that, within a paternalistic society, women's bodies, and particularly women's sexuality and reproductive health, has not always been under their control. To what extent is this sort of gender dynamic playing out now, do you think?
Again, this is a really interesting one for me because when I started this, it was really small fry, and I wasn't looking big picture at all. And it was only when people started emailing me and saying like, Helen, you know, prolapse is political, like literally in capital letters, that I really started wondering what the backdrop was. And if you add on to that all the message that I have from women who say, you know, they go to the GP and they're sent away with maybe a leaflet at best, but a lot of kind of, you know, this is just normal when you have babies. It's practice for menopause. I've heard that from a 30-year-old woman recently. And all of that makes you sort of think this is against the backdrop of the gender health gap in, that has existed for centuries.
So, Helen, the podcast is called Skin Like a Rhino, which is an expression that I've used quite frequently, because I think for any entrepreneur, but particularly if you're a female entrepreneur in such a male-dominated world, you have to develop this sort of skin like a rhino. But I think even more so if you're working on an issue like you and I have been working on, which is to do with vaginas and taboo issues to do with pelvic floor health. You know, along the way, I'm sure there must have been people sort of saying no to you. Like, how were you able to sort of cut through the naysayers, cut out that noise, and just keep a focus on what you're doing?
I'm going to be greedy and have two answers. I guess the first person saying no was me, right? I had to get past myself and my embarrassment of actually discussing the issues that I have, my prolapse, saying all the words that I didn't want to say. And that was a struggle, but because I felt it was so important that I wanted to do this and the need for it was so great, I knew that because of the messages that I was getting from women who were reading the Instagram posts and saying that they were going through similar very low points. I knew that I had to do that, right? So I had to get past the embarrassment. And then the other thing, so when I decided that I was going to make a podcast, Why Mums Don't Jump, I was working as a journalist and I did pitch it to a couple of podcast platforms. Because, you know, with podcasts, like if you've got a big platform behind you, then that's going to make it so much easier to get out there and reach people, which is obviously what I wanted to do. And it was turned down and fine, you know. But the word that was used in one of the rejections was niche. We think that, you know, this pelvic floor business is too niche. And I thought about that for a while, and it like, okay, you could say that it's niche if by niche you mean like it's a narrow subject matter. Like, okay, it's niche, like football's niche, right? Or Love Island is niche. In that sense, it's niche, but that to me is not a good enough answer. Yeah. But really, if by niche what you mean by that is that it's not very common, or we think it's just like a very small, isolated minority of people, then you and I know that that is not the case. And that puts so much fire in my belly to be like, right, I've got a bit of rage now. I have to prove you wrong, because I know, because I'm getting messages from women saying I can't bend down to bathe my children. I used to run. I'm never going to do that anymore. You know, I can't do my job because I can't lift the things I need to lift. And I can't tell my boss about it. And I can't tell my partner about it. And it's affecting lives and relationships and all of those things. I was just like, okay, it's not going to be a big podcast platform. It's just going to be me. But in a way that gave me the freedom also to do it how I wanted to do it, and to just stay true to this message of, you know, hope and just letting people know that they're not on their own with it.
So out of that adversity, you're able to sort of find the silver lining, right?
Yeah.
It ended up being, in some ways, you had your own freedom around that. But also, what was it in you? I mean, being told no, most people would probably just feel rejected and quite likely give up, right? Or sort of blame themselves. Whereas for you, it gave you more fire in your belly.
I know, but
where did that resilience come from?
I don't know, because normally I would have been one of those persons who would just be like, oh, okay, then it's probably a bad idea, I'll just give up. But there's just something about this, and I think it's probably through lived experience, but more so through the voices of the women that I speak to, that I just knew they were wrong. And I think sometimes, you know, we have a bone that we can't let go of, don't we? And this was mine. And yeah, like, you know, look at how far it's come. And maybe it was always meant to be like this, because if it had been picked up in the way that I'd wanted it to be in the first place, maybe it wouldn't have had the, I don't know, truth and grit to it that it has had to get to this point. And maybe it wouldn't have landed like right now at a time when we are having bigger conversations about women's health, and it feels more relevant and like people are prepared to listen. So yeah, I guess that was my moment.
Well, Helen, I think that bone that you refuse to let go of, I think I and the world thanks you for that.
Oh, thank you very much.